The lawyer's voice crackled through my phone speaker as I stood in the cereal aisle of my local grocery store, trying to decide between granola brands. Mrs. Dawson, I'm calling regarding the estate of David Hartley. According to his life insurance policy and investment accounts, you've been listed as the primary beneficiary. The box of cereal slipped from my fingers, scattering oats across the linoleum floor. David was dead. My ex-husband of 7 years, the man I hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade, had somehow left me everything. And his widow, Vanessa, was already threatening to make my life a living hell over it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The notification had arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, unremarkable in every way except for the message it carried. I'd been working from my small home office in Bellhaven, Oregon, a coastal town I'd escaped to 3 years prior when the noise of Portland had become too much. My consulting work in graphic design kept me busy enough, and the rhythmic sound of waves outside my window provided the kind of peace I'd spent years searching for. The call from Denise Cho, an attorney I'd never heard of, shattered that peace like a rock through glass. I need you to come to Portland as soon as possible, Denise had said after the initial shock wore off. There are complications. His current wife is contesting the beneficiary designation, and we need to move quickly to protect your interests. The word current echoed in my mind. Vanessa Hartley, the woman David had married 2 years after our divorce was finalized. I'd never met her, never wanted to. Our separation had been clean, or so I thought. No children to complicate things, just a division of assets and a mutual agreement to move forward separately. I sat down heavily on my kitchen floor, the phone still pressed to my ear, trying to process this information. Why would David keep me as his beneficiary? We'd had a cordial divorce, as far as these things go. He'd wanted different things, I'd wanted different things, and after 6 years of marriage, we'd acknowledged we'd grown into incompatible people. There had been no dramatic fights, no infidelity that I knew of, just a slow realization that we were roommates playing at being a couple. The money involved wasn't insignificant. Denise mentioned figures that made my stomach clench. Life insurance policies worth $500,000, retirement accounts, investment portfolios. David had done well for himself in the years since our split. He'd climbed the ladder at his tech company, something he'd always been driven to do. I remembered how his ambition had been one of the things that first attracted me to him, back when we were both young professionals trying to make our mark in Portland's competitive job market. Now that same success had created a windfall I never asked for and didn't feel entitled to. Vanessa's rage made sense to me. If I'd been in her position, would have felt betrayed too. A husband who never bothered to update his beneficiary information after remarrying? It seemed like either gross negligence or a deliberate choice, and neither option painted David in a flattering light. I drove to Portland the next morning, watching the familiar landscape shift from Bellhaven's rugged coastline to the urban sprawl of the city I'd once called home. Denise's office occupied the 12th floor of a downtown high-rise, all glass and steel and the kind of corporate polish I'd deliberately left behind. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with sharp eyes that assessed me the moment I walked through her door. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said, gesturing to a leather chair across from her desk. "I know this must be overwhelming." The documents she spread before me told a story I hadn't known existed. David had updated his beneficiary designations multiple times over the years. The most recent change had occurred just 8 months ago, well into his marriage to Vanessa. He'd actively chosen to keep me listed, going so far as to increase the policy amounts. This wasn't an oversight, Denise explained, her finger tracing the signatures and dates. He made these changes deliberately and recently. That's going to be crucial when Vanessa's attorneys try to claim this was a mistake or that he lacked capacity. My head spun with questions. Why would David do this? We'd barely exchanged holiday cards in recent years, the kind of superficial contact that former spouses maintain out of politeness rather than genuine connection. I searched my memory for some indication that he'd been thinking of me, some sign I'd missed. There was nothing. Our last interaction had been nearly 2 years ago, a brief email exchange when I'd changed my mailing address and wanted to make sure he had the updated information for tax purposes. He'd responded with a simple thanks and a hope that I was doing well. Professional. Distant. Exactly what you'd expect from someone you used to share a life with but no longer knew. Vanessa is alleging undue influence, Denise continued, pulling out another folder. She's claiming you manipulated David into maintaining these designations, possibly through continued romantic contact. The accusation stung like a slap. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, a mixture of indignation and disbelief. I haven't seen David in person since our divorce was finalized 7 years ago. I haven't called him, texted him beyond basic administrative necessities, or had any contact that could remotely be considered romantic or manipulative. Denise nodded, making notes on her legal pad. That's what I expected you to say, and frankly, it's what the evidence supports. But Vanessa has resources, and she's hired a firm that specializes in estate litigation. They're going to dig into every aspect of your life and your past relationship with David. They'll look for any thread they can pull to unravel this. The weight of what lay ahead settled onto my shoulders like a physical burden. I'd come to Bellhaven to escape complexity, to build a simpler life focused on my work and personal peace. Now I was being dragged into a legal battle over money I'd never expected and didn't particularly want. Can I just refuse it? I asked, the question emerging before I'd fully thought it through. Just sign everything over to Vanessa and walk away? Denise's expression shifted, something between sympathy and frustration crossing her features. You could, but I'd strongly advise against it. First, refusing a beneficiary designation this substantial has tax implications you need to understand. Second, and more importantly, David made this choice for a reason. Walking away doesn't honor that choice, and it sets a dangerous precedent for anyone who wants to bully beneficiaries into giving up legitimate inheritances. Her words resonated with something deep inside me, a stubbornness I'd thought I'd left behind in my corporate days. I'd spent too many years of my marriage deferring to David's preferences, smoothing over conflicts, making myself smaller to keep the peace. The pattern had continued even after our divorce, with me automatically assuming I should step aside, not make waves, not cause problems. Maybe that's exactly what Vanessa was counting on. Tell me about the funeral, I said, changing direction. When is it? Denise consulted her calendar. This Saturday at Evergreen Memorial Park. You're not obligated to attend, and given the circumstances, it might be uncomfortable. But you have every right to be there if you choose. The thought of facing Vanessa at David's funeral made my stomach twist with anxiety. Yet something in me rebelled at the idea of hiding, of treating my past with David as something shameful that needed to be concealed. I'll think about it, I told Denise, gathering my things. What do you need from me right now? She handed me a thick folder of documents. Read through these, sign where indicated, and get them back to me by Friday. Don't talk to anyone from Vanessa's legal team without me present. Don't discuss this situation on social media or with anyone who might report back to them. And Claire, she added as I stood to leave, prepare yourself for this to get ugly. Estate battles always bring out the worst in people. The drive back to Bellhaven felt longer than usual, my mind churning through possibilities and implications. I'd built a life in this small coastal town precisely because it was uncomplicated. My rental cottage, small and weathered but charming, sat just 2 blocks from the ocean. My neighbors were friendly without being intrusive. My work allowed me to support myself comfortably without the stress of office politics or corporate ladders. Now this inheritance threatened to upend everything I'd carefully constructed. I arrived home as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that usually brought me comfort. Instead, I felt restless and unsettled. I made tea I didn't drink and attempted to review the documents Denise had given me, but the legal language swam before my eyes. Finally, I gave up and walked down to the beach, letting the wind whip my hair and the salt spray sting my face. A figure waved from further down the shore, and I recognized Patty Brennan, my neighbor from 3 houses down. She and her husband Thomas ran a small farm stand on the edge of town, selling produce and flowers to locals and the occasional tourist. Patty had been one of the first people to welcome me to Bellhaven, showing up at my door with a basket of vegetables and an invitation to dinner that I'd been too overwhelmed to accept at the time. She'd been patient with my standoffishness, gradually drawing me into the community through small gestures and genuine kindness. "You look like you've had a day," Patty observed as she approached, her weathered face creasing with concern. "I'm all right," I started to say automatically, then stopped myself. The truth was I wasn't all right, and pretending otherwise suddenly felt exhausting. "Actually, I'm dealing with something complicated and I'm not sure how to handle it." Patty linked her arm through mine, steering us back toward the houses. "Come have dinner with Thomas and me. You can talk about it or not, whatever you need. But you shouldn't be alone right now." I felt resistance rise up, the old habit of handling everything myself, of not burdening others with my problems. Then I remembered Denise's warning about the battle ahead and realized I was going to need allies, people who knew me and could vouch for my character if things got as ugly as she predicted. Over Patty's home-cooked stew and fresh bread, I found myself telling them everything. David's death, the beneficiary designation, Vanessa's threats, the looming legal battle. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas listened quietly, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug, while Patty asked occasional clarifying questions. When I finished, they exchanged a long look that spoke of decades of shared communication. "This ex-husband of yours," Thomas said finally, "seems like he was trying to take care of you even after you split. That says something about the kind of man he was." The words hit me unexpectedly hard, and I felt tears prick my eyes. I hadn't let myself think about David as a person yet, only as a problem to be solved. Now I had to confront the reality that he was gone, that whatever his reasons for keeping me as his beneficiary, I'd never get to ask him about them. "Vanessa probably sees you as a threat," Patty added gently. "Not because of anything you did, but because your existence reminds her that she wasn't his first choice, wasn't his whole story. That's hard for anyone to accept." I wiped my eyes with the napkin Patty handed me. "I don't want his money. I never asked for this. I just want to go back to my quiet life." Thomas leaned forward, his expression serious. "Sometimes we don't get to choose our battles. They choose us. The question isn't whether you want this fight, it's whether you're going to let someone else decide what you deserve." His words settled into my chest, finding a home next to my earlier resistance to simply walking away. I'd spent my marriage and my divorce being reasonable, being accommodating, being the person who made things easier for everyone else. Where had that gotten me? To a small town where I was safe but also hiding, where I'd built walls against complications and in doing so had also shut out possibilities. "I'll go to the funeral," I heard myself say. "I have just as much right to be there as anyone else." Patty squeezed my hand approvingly. "Would you like us to come with you? For support?" The offer touched me deeply. These people who'd known me only a few years were willing to drive hours to stand beside me in what would undoubtedly be an uncomfortable situation. "That's incredibly kind," I said, meaning it. "But I think I need to do this on my own." The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. I signed the documents Denise needed, providing detailed accounts of my limited contact with David over the years since our divorce. I pulled together old emails and text messages, creating a timeline that demonstrated the professional distance I'd maintained. I even found our divorce decree, with its clear division of assets and absence of any ongoing financial obligations between us. Friday evening, I stood in front of my closet trying to decide what one wears to an ex-husband's funeral when his widow has accused you of manipulation and theft. Everything felt wrong, too flashy or too drab, too expensive or too cheap. Finally, I settled on a simple navy dress I'd bought for a client presentation years ago. Professional, respectful, unmemorable. I barely slept that night, my mind playing out scenarios of what might happen at the funeral. Would Vanessa confront me publicly? Would David's family know about the beneficiary situation? Would anyone even remember who I was, or had David's life moved so far beyond our shared past that I'd become a footnote, if that? The drive to Portland began before dawn, the highway mostly empty in the early morning hours. I'd planned to arrive early, slip into the back of the memorial service, and leave quickly once it ended. No drama, no confrontation, just paying my respects and honoring the years David and I had shared, whatever they'd meant. Evergreen Memorial Park spread across rolling hills on Portland's east side, manicured lawns dotted with oak trees and granite headstones. I followed the signs to the chapel, a modern building with walls of windows that let in natural light. Cars already filled most of the parking lot, and I recognized the corporate logos on several vehicles. David's co-workers, turning out to honor a colleague taken too young. I sat in my car for a long moment, gathering courage. Through the chapel windows, I could see people gathering, greeting each other with the awkward intimacy of shared grief. Then I saw her. Vanessa stood at the entrance, elegant in black, greeting arrivals with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to hosting. Even from this distance, I could see she was beautiful, polished in a way I'd never quite managed. Blonde hair swept into a perfect chignon, understated jewelry, the kind of composure that came from confidence and privilege. My resolve wavered. What was I doing here? I didn't belong in this gathering of David's current life, these people who'd known him as he'd become, not as he'd been. Then I remembered Thomas's words about battles choosing us, and I opened my car door before I could change my mind. The walk across the parking lot felt endless. Vanessa's eyes found me when I was still 20 feet away, and I watched recognition flash across her face, followed immediately by fury. She said something to the man beside her, David's brother Preston if I remembered correctly, and they both turned to stare as I approached. "Claire," Vanessa said, my name emerging like an accusation. "How dare you show your face here?" The people around us fell silent, conversations cutting off mid-sentence as the tension became palpable. I forced my voice to remain steady, refusing to be intimidated. "I came to pay my respects to David. We were married for 6 years. I have every right to be here." "You have no rights," she hissed, stepping closer. "Not to be here, not to his money, not to anything. You're a parasite who somehow manipulated him into keeping you in his will. Well, I'm going to make sure you don't see a penny of what's rightfully mine." The attack was so vicious, so public, that I actually felt myself recoil. Around us, mourners shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they hadn't heard. Preston moved to stand beside Vanessa, his expression hard with judgment, while others hung back, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to get involved. "That's enough," a new voice cut through the tension. An older woman I didn't recognize stepped forward, her silver hair and lined face speaking of age and authority. David's mother, I realized, seeing the family resemblance in her sharp features. "Both of you should be ashamed, conducting yourselves this way at my son's funeral. Vanessa, go inside and compose yourself. Claire, you may stay if you wish, but I'd appreciate if you'd sit in the back and leave immediately after the service." It wasn't exactly welcoming, but it wasn't the outright banishment Vanessa had demanded. I nodded gratefully, murmuring my thanks and my condolences before slipping past the crowd into the chapel. True to my plan, I found a seat in the very last row, tucked into the corner where I could observe without being observed. The service was beautiful and heartbreaking. Colleagues spoke of David's brilliance, his dedication, his dry sense of humor that had made even the most stressful projects bearable. Friends shared stories of camping trips and sports events, painting a picture of a man who'd built a rich life in the years since our marriage ended. Vanessa gave a eulogy that was both moving and pointed, speaking of the love they'd shared and the future they'd been building together, cut short by sudden heart failure at only 41. I let myself cry quietly in my corner, mourning not just David but the young couple we'd been, the dreams we'd shared that hadn't panned out, the paths our lives had taken separately. When Vanessa mentioned their plans to start a family soon, my tears intensified. David had wanted children when we were married, but I'd been focused on my career, always saying not yet, not yet. Had he found someone ready to give him what I couldn't? Was that why he'd kept me as beneficiary, some complicated guilt about how our marriage had ended? The service concluded, and people filed out slowly, many heading to a reception at a restaurant Vanessa had mentioned. I waited until the chapel had mostly cleared before standing to leave. As I reached the door, a hand touched my elbow. David's mother stood there, her eyes red from crying but her expression surprisingly soft. "I remember you," she said quietly. "You made him happy, before you didn't." I'm sorry for your loss too, Claire. Whatever games are being played with money and lawyers, that doesn't change that you loved my son once, and he loved you. Her words broke something open in my chest, and I found myself embracing this woman I'd only met a handful of times during my marriage, both of us crying for the man we'd lost in different ways. When we separated, she pressed a card into my hand. If you need anything during this legal mess, call me. I may not agree with what David did, but I won't stand by and watch you be destroyed for his choices. I drove back to Bellhaven in a daze, the funeral program and Diane's card sitting on my passenger seat. The person I'd been that morning felt different from who I was becoming. I'd stood my ground against Vanessa's attack. I'd claimed my right to mourn. I'd accepted support from unexpected sources. These were small victories, but they felt significant. Patty was waiting on my porch when I arrived home, a basket covered with a cloth beside her. I brought dinner, she said simply. Figured you wouldn't feel like cooking. We ate together in comfortable silence, and when I finally told her about the confrontation with Vanessa and the surprising support from David's mother, Patty nodded as if it all made perfect sense. You're stronger than you think, Claire, she said. This is just the beginning, and it's going to test you in ways you can't imagine yet. But you don't have to face it alone. Her words proved prophetic. The following week, Denise called with news that Vanessa's legal team had filed formal challenges to the beneficiary designations, alleging fraud, undue influence, and lack of testamentary capacity. The battle I'd hoped to avoid was now unavoidable, and I found myself standing at a crossroads that would determine not just my financial future but the kind of person I was going to be. The papers arrived on a Wednesday morning, delivered by a courier who made me sign 3 separate forms before handing over the thick manila envelope. I stood in my doorway, salt air whipping around me, staring at the legal documents that formalized Vanessa's intent to destroy me. The language was dense and accusatory, painting me as a conniving manipulator who'd somehow maintained a secret hold over David throughout his second marriage. According to her attorneys, I'd exploited our past relationship to convince him to maintain beneficiary designations that rightfully belonged to his current spouse. Reading through the allegations felt surreal, like watching someone describe a life I'd never lived. They claimed I'd maintained regular contact with David, citing phone records that supposedly showed frequent communication. They suggested I'd leveraged intimate knowledge of his psychological vulnerabilities to manipulate his decision-making. They even implied that our divorce had been a sham, designed to allow David to protect assets from Vanessa while maintaining his primary relationship with me. None of it was true, but the construction was clever enough to plant doubt in anyone who didn't know the full story. I called Denise immediately, my hands shaking as I held the documents. They're alleging things that never happened. They're creating an entire fictional narrative. I know, Denise said calmly. I received my copy this morning. It's aggressive, but it's also desperate. They're throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. The good news is that most of their claims are demonstrably false. The bad news is that disproving them is going to require us to thoroughly document your life for the past 7 years. The invasion of privacy that Prospect represented made me feel physically ill. Every email, every text message, every social media post would be scrutinized for evidence that might support Vanessa's claims. My quiet life in Bellhaven, which I'd built deliberately away from drama and complication, was about to be dissected by hostile strangers looking for ammunition. I need you to put together a comprehensive timeline, Denise continued. Every job you've held since the divorce, every place you've lived, relationships you've had, major purchases, travel, everything. We need to show the court that you built a completely separate life from David, that you moved on genuinely and completely. Hanging up, I felt the enormity of the task ahead settle onto my shoulders. I'd been so focused on putting the past behind me that I'd never imagined having to reconstruct it in excruciating detail. My laptop sat on the small desk in my cottage, and I opened it with a sense of dread, creating a new document titled Timeline Post-Divorce. The exercise proved unexpectedly painful. Those first years after leaving David emerged in fragments. The tiny studio apartment in northwest Portland where I'd cried myself to sleep more nights than I cared to remember. The freelance design work I'd taken to supplement my income after leaving the firm where we'd both worked. The slow, painful process of rebuilding a social circle after realizing how many of our mutual friends had sided with David or simply drifted away rather than navigate the awkwardness of staying close to both of us. I dated sporadically during those years, nothing serious until Marcus, a high school teacher I'd met at a coffee shop. We'd been together for almost 2 years, and for a while I'd thought we might have a future. But Marcus had wanted marriage and children, and I'd realized I wasn't ready to commit to either again so soon. We'd ended things amicably, and he'd moved to Seattle for a new teaching position. I added his contact information to my timeline, knowing Denise would want to interview him. After Marcus came the decision to leave Portland entirely. The city held too many memories, too many places I couldn't visit without remembering some moment from my marriage. A former client had mentioned Bellhaven during a project discussion, describing it as a hidden gem on the Oregon coast where artists and writers went to find inspiration. I'd visited on a whim one weekend and felt something shift inside me when I walked along the beach. Within 3 months, I'd sublet my apartment, packed my essential belongings, and moved into the cottage I still rented. Bellhaven had offered exactly what I needed, a chance to start fresh in a place with no history, no expectations, no ghosts around every corner. I joined the local Chamber of Commerce to network for design clients, started attending a weekly yoga class at the community center, even volunteered at the library's literacy program. The life I'd built was modest but authentic, shaped by my choices rather than compromises with a partner. None of which would matter to Vanessa's attorneys, who would find ways to twist even my most innocent activities into evidence of obsession with David. The yoga class became a way to stay attractive for him. The volunteer work was cover for having too much free time because I was waiting for him to leave his wife. The small cottage was proof I was living below my means, clearly expecting a windfall from his eventual death. The unfairness of it made me want to scream. I stood up from my desk, pacing the small living room like a caged animal. Through the window, I could see Patty working in her garden, her steady movements as she tended her plants radiating the kind of peace I desperately needed. Without consciously deciding to, I found myself walking over, drawn by the promise of normalcy. Patty looked up as I approached, taking in whatever my face revealed. Bad news? Just legal things, I said, settling onto the wooden bench Thomas had built beside the raised beds. They want me to document everything about my life since the divorce. Prove I wasn't secretly pining for David or manipulating him from afar. Patty pulled off her gardening gloves, giving me her full attention. You know what I think? I think this has very little to do with you and everything to do with that widow trying to rewrite history. She's probably been dealing with feeling second best throughout her marriage, and now she's found a target for all that resentment. The observation struck me as perceptive. I'd been so focused on defending myself against Vanessa's accusations that I hadn't considered what might be driving them beyond simple greed. What if David had made her feel inadequate? What if their marriage had been troubled, and his failure to change his beneficiary designations had been a symptom of deeper problems? You're not responsible for their marriage, Patty added, as if reading my thoughts. Whatever was or wasn't working between them, that's not on you. You divorced him, built a new life, moved on. That's healthy and normal. What's not normal is keeping an ex-wife as beneficiary through a remarriage, but that was David's choice, not yours. Her words helped, but they didn't solve my immediate problem. I still had to produce this timeline, still had to prepare for depositions and court appearances where every aspect of my character would be questioned. The thought exhausted me before I'd even begun. Come help me with the tomatoes, Patty suggested, handing me a basket. Sometimes physical work helps clear the mind. She was right. The simple act of moving through the rows, selecting ripe tomatoes and leaving the green ones to mature, created a meditative rhythm that calmed my racing thoughts. We worked in companionable silence, the sun warm on my shoulders and the scent of tomato plants sharp and green in my nose. You ever grow vegetables? Patty asked after a while. Not really, I admitted. My mom had a small garden when I was young, but I never paid much attention. I was too busy with other things. Well, you're learning now, she said with satisfaction. Next spring, we'll set up some beds for you at your place. Nothing fancy, just enough for fresh salads and herbs. There's something grounding about growing your own food, about putting your hands in dirt and nurturing something from seed to harvest. The offer touched me more than she probably realized. It implied a future, a continuation of the life I'd built here rather than the disruption I feared the legal battle would bring. It suggested she believed I'd still be here next spring, still her neighbor, still part of this community. We carried the harvested tomatoes back to her kitchen, where she immediately began sorting them. These for eating fresh, these for sauce, these for the farm stand. Her efficiency and purpose reminded me of something I'd lost in recent years. Before the divorce, I'd been ambitious and driven, always working toward the next goal. After, I'd become adrift, going through motions without clear direction. Even my move to Bellhaven had been more about escape than pursuit. "What do you want, Claire?" Patty asked suddenly, looking up from the tomatoes. "Not what you think you should want, not what would make this legal mess easier. What do you actually want for your life?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I opened my mouth to answer and realized I didn't know. For so long, I defined myself in negative terms by what I didn't want: complications, drama, relationships that demanded too much compromise. But what did I want? What would I build if I had the resources and freedom to choose? "I don't know," I admitted quietly. "I've been so focused on just getting through each day, on being okay, that I haven't thought about what thriving might look like." Patty nodded as if this was exactly the answer she'd expected. "Well, while you're putting together timelines and dealing with lawyers, I want you to think about that. Because this inheritance, if you keep it, could give you options. Real options. The question is whether you know what to do with them." Her words followed me home, taking up residence in my mind alongside all my anxieties about the legal battle. That night, instead of working on the timeline, I opened a fresh document and titled it simply "What I Want." The blank page mocked me, and I almost closed it several times. But something Patty had said about nurturing things from seed to harvest stuck with me. I started typing, letting thoughts flow without editing. I wanted to feel proud of my work again, not just competent but genuinely excited about projects. I wanted a home I owned rather than rented, with space for a real office and maybe that vegetable garden Patty had mentioned. I wanted friendships that went deeper than pleasant neighborly interactions, people who knew my full story and chose to stick around anyway. I wanted to stop feeling like I was hiding in Bellhaven and start feeling like I was building something here. The list grew longer, surprising me with desires I hadn't let myself acknowledge. I wanted to travel, not for escape but for genuine exploration and joy. I wanted to take risks on creative projects without the constant worry about financial stability. I wanted to fall in love again someday, with someone who saw me as a full partner rather than a supporting character in their story. Looking at what I'd written, I realized these weren't outrageous dreams requiring millions of dollars. They were modest, achievable goals that I'd been too afraid or too numb to pursue. The inheritance David had left me could provide security and opportunity, but only if I was willing to fight for it. More importantly, only if I believed I deserved it. The next morning, I woke with renewed determination. I opened the timeline document and began filling in details with methodical precision. Every job, complete with contact information for references who could verify my work and attest to my character. Every apartment and house I'd rented, with landlords who could confirm I'd lived alone. Every relationship, brief or significant, with dates and explanations of how we'd met and why we'd parted. The exercise took 3 full days of intense work. By the end, I had a 40-page document that left no gaps in my post-divorce life unaccounted for. I'd reached out to former colleagues, past romantic partners, even my yoga instructor and the library volunteer coordinator. Each conversation had been awkward in its own way, explaining that I needed them to potentially testify about my character and activities during specific time periods. To their credit, everyone I contacted agreed to help. Denise received the timeline with approval. "This is excellent work, Claire. Thorough and detailed. We'll use this to build your defense and to depose witnesses who can corroborate your account." She paused, and I heard papers shuffling. "I also want to prepare you for what's coming next. Vanessa's team is going to depose you, probably within the next few weeks. They'll ask invasive questions designed to fluster you or trick you into contradictions. You need to be prepared." The thought of sitting across from hostile attorneys, answering questions about my private life while they searched for ways to discredit me, made my stomach churn. What should I do? Tell the truth, simply and directly. Don't elaborate unless asked. Don't let them provoke you into anger or defensiveness. Remember that they're looking for emotional reactions they can use against you. Stay calm, stay factual, and trust that the truth is on your side. Easy for her to say. She'd been through countless depositions, developed immunity to the stress and intimidation. I was a graphic designer whose most confrontational professional experience involved convincing clients that their color choices were objectively terrible. The skills didn't translate. I want you to practice, Denise continued. I'm going to send you a list of likely questions. Rehearse your answers out loud until they feel natural. Better yet, have a friend play the hostile attorney and practice responding to aggressive questioning. I thought immediately of Rachel Winters, a writer I'd met at the Bellhaven Community Center during a workshop on digital marketing for small businesses. We'd bonded over coffee afterward, discovering shared perspectives on creativity and independence. Rachel had a sharp wit and no patience for nonsense, qualities that would make her perfect for this role. When I called to ask, she agreed immediately. Oh, I am absolutely here for this. I've always wanted to be a ruthless attorney. When do we start? We met at the Driftwood Cafe the next evening, claiming a corner table where we wouldn't disturb other patrons. Rachel had printed out the questions Denise sent and added several of her own invention, claiming she wanted to make sure I was prepared for anything. The session was brutal. Rachel attacked every answer I gave, twisting my words and implying ulterior motives I'd never considered. When I mentioned that David and I had remained cordial after the divorce, she pounced. Cordial how? Did cordial include intimate dinners? Late-night phone calls? Secret meetings? No, I protested, feeling defensive despite knowing this was practice. Just occasional emails about tax documents or forwarding mail. Nothing personal. Nothing personal, Rachel repeated mockingly, channeling the hostile attorney perfectly. Yet you maintained contact for 7 years. That seems like a long time to stay connected to someone you claim to have moved on from. Most divorced couples cut ties completely, don't they? The question rattled me because it touched on something I'd wondered myself. Why had David and I maintained even that minimal contact? Was it truly just administrative necessity, or had we both been reluctant to completely sever the connection? We had shared financial history, I said carefully. Joint tax returns from our married years that occasionally needed documentation. We'd owned a car together that we sold after the divorce, and there were follow-up questions from the buyer. Normal post-divorce administrative issues. Rachel made a note, then looked up with a predatory smile. Let's talk about your relationships after the divorce. You dated several men casually, then had a serious relationship with Marcus Fieldstone. Why did that relationship end? I took a breath, remembering Denise's advice to stay calm and factual. Marcus wanted to get married and have children. I wasn't ready for that commitment again so soon after my divorce. We wanted different things, so we ended it mutually. So you were still emotionally attached to your ex-husband, Rachel suggested. Too attached to commit to a new relationship. That's why you couldn't marry Marcus. The unfair leap in logic made me want to argue, but I forced myself to respond calmly instead. No, I was being honest about my emotional readiness. I just ended a 6-year marriage. I needed time to figure out who I was independently before committing to another serious relationship. That's healthy self-awareness, not obsession with an ex. Rachel grinned, dropping the hostile attorney persona. Good answer. Much better than your first instinct, which I could see was to tell me I was full of crap. She's right though, you know. The truth is your friend here. You have perfectly reasonable explanations for everything because you actually lived a normal, healthy post-divorce life. We practiced for 2 more hours, Rachel throwing increasingly outrageous scenarios at me until I could respond to almost anything without flinching. By the end, I felt bruised but better prepared. More importantly, I'd begun to see my own story more clearly. I'd spent years feeling vaguely guilty about my divorce, as if I'd failed at something important. But walking through the timeline and defending my choices, I recognized that I'd actually handled a difficult situation with grace and maturity. The deposition was scheduled for the following Tuesday at Denise's office. Vanessa's legal team wanted to conduct it at their downtown high-rise, probably hoping the intimidating setting would throw me off balance, but Denise had insisted on neutral ground. I drove to Portland the night before, staying at a modest hotel to avoid the early morning drive. Sleep came in fitful patches, my mind rehearsing answers and imagining worst-case scenarios. I finally gave up around 5 a.m, showering and dressing with methodical care. Professional but not flashy, Denise had advised. You want to project competence and credibility. I chose gray slacks and a simple blue blouse, minimal jewelry, my hair pulled back in a neat bun. The deposition began at 9 sharp. Vanessa's attorney, a man named Lawrence Chen with shark eyes and an expensive suit, started with seemingly innocuous questions about my background and current life. Where I'd grown up, where I'd gone to school, how I'd met David. His tone was pleasant, almost friendly, which somehow made it more unsettling. Then the questions sharpened. When exactly had I last seen David in person? Could I describe the circumstances? Had we met alone or with others present? The implication was clear even though he never stated it directly that I was lying about the limited nature of our post-divorce contact. I maintained my composure, answering each question simply and directly as Denise had coached. The last time I saw David in person was at our final divorce hearing 7 years ago. We were both present with our respective attorneys to sign the final papers. Before that, our last in-person contact was when we divided our belongings 3 months earlier, again with witnesses present. Lawrence made notes, his expression giving nothing away. And you're absolutely certain there were no other meetings? Perhaps chance encounters that slipped your mind? Portland isn't that large of a city. I'm certain, I replied firmly. I moved to Bellhaven 3 years ago specifically because Portland felt too small. Too many memories and potential awkward encounters. I wanted a fresh start somewhere new. He shifted tactics, pulling out phone records that supposedly showed calls between my number and David's. Can you explain these communications? I examined the records, feeling my heart sink. There were indeed several calls, though far fewer than Lawrence's tone implied. Most lasted under 2 minutes. Those appear to be related to tax season, I said, pointing to the dates clustered in March and April of various years. David and I filed jointly our last year of marriage, and I occasionally had questions about documentation from my tax preparer. The calls were brief and strictly about financial records. Strictly about financial records, Lawrence repeated. Yet some of these calls lasted longer. This one, he pointed to a call from 2 years ago, shows a duration of 17 minutes. That's quite lengthy for a simple records request. I frowned, trying to remember. That timing corresponded with when I'd changed my address and contacted David about updating information. Then I remembered, and relief washed over me. That call was about our old car. The one we'd sold after the divorce. The buyer had tracked me down with a question about the title transfer, and I needed to contact David to help sort it out. Most of that 17 minutes was spent on hold while he looked through his files for the paperwork. Lawrence's expression suggested he didn't believe me, but he moved on to other topics. My relationship with Marcus came under particular scrutiny, with Lawrence suggesting that my inability to commit proved I was emotionally unavailable due to lingering feelings for David. I ended that relationship because I wasn't ready to remarry anyone, I explained patiently. It had nothing to do with David specifically and everything to do with needing more time to develop my independent identity. If anything, my hesitation proved I'd learned from rushing into my first marriage too young. The deposition stretched through lunch and into the afternoon, covering every aspect of my life with tedious thoroughness. Lawrence questioned my career choices, my financial decisions, even my volunteer work at the library. He seemed particularly interested in my income, suggesting that someone living as modestly as I did must have been expecting financial support from somewhere. I live within my means, I stated firmly. My design consulting provides adequate income for my needs, and I prefer a simpler lifestyle to the consumption-driven existence I had in Portland. That's a personal choice, not evidence of financial desperation. By the time Denise finally called an end to the proceedings, citing the agreed-upon time limit, I felt wrung out like a dish rag. But I'd held my ground, answered every question truthfully, and refused to be intimidated into contradictions or admissions that weren't accurate. "You did well," Denise told me after Lawrence and his assistant had left. "Very well. You stayed calm, you were consistent, and you didn't give him anything he can use against you." I slumped in my chair, exhausted. That was one of the hardest things I've ever done. "It gets easier," she assured me. "And now you know what to expect when we go to court. Because that's where this is heading. Vanessa isn't going to settle, and neither should you. Her claim is baseless, and we're going to prove it." Driving back to Bellhaven that evening, I felt something shift inside me. The deposition had been an ordeal, but I'd survived it. More than that, I defended myself articulately and honestly. The woman who'd let David make decisions for her during their marriage, who deferred and accommodated and made herself smaller, wouldn't have managed that. But I wasn't that woman anymore. Patty was waiting on my porch when I arrived home, a thermos of tea and 2 mugs sitting on the small table beside her rocking chair. She didn't ask how it went, just poured the tea and handed me a cup while I settled into the chair beside hers. The ocean was rough today, waves crashing against the rocks with a violence that matched my internal state. "I told them everything," I said after a long silence. "Every detail of my life since the divorce. Every relationship, every job, every decision. They made it all sound suspicious, like I was hiding something or plotting something." "Were you?" Patty asked mildly. "Of course not. I was just living my life, trying to figure out who I was without David." "Then you have nothing to worry about. The truth is the truth, no matter how they try to twist it." She sipped her tea, her weathered hand steady around the mug. "You know what I think? I think you need to stop defending yourself and start building something." I looked at her, not understanding. "What do you mean?" "You've spent 3 years in Bellhaven being perfectly pleasant and perfectly invisible," Patty said bluntly. "You do your work, you're friendly to neighbors, you volunteer at the library. But you're not really here. You're just not in Portland. There's a difference." Her words stung because they were accurate. I'd been so focused on what I was escaping that I'd never fully committed to what I was moving toward. Even my cottage felt temporary, furnished with rental basics and lacking any real personality. I hadn't hung artwork on the walls or planted perennials in the small yard. Everything about my life here screamed temporary, as if I was perpetually ready to flee again. "What would building something look like?" I asked quietly. "That's for you to figure out. But I'll tell you this, if you win this legal battle and get that inheritance, you'll have choices. The question is whether you'll know what to do with them or whether you'll just find a fancier place to hide." The challenge in her voice sparked something in me, an ember of the ambition I'd thought I'd lost. That night, I pulled out the document I'd titled What I Want and read through it again. The goals I'd listed felt more urgent now, less like idle wishes and more like actual possibilities worth pursuing. I started small. The next morning, I contacted a realtor in Bellhaven and asked about properties for sale. Not to buy immediately, but to understand what was available and what I could potentially afford if the inheritance came through. Just taking that step, acknowledging that I might put down actual roots here, felt significant. The realtor, a cheerful woman named Sandra Liu, sent me listings that ranged from small fixer-uppers to larger homes with ocean views. I found myself drawn to a modest craftsman-style house 3 blocks from the beach, with a detached studio that could serve as an office and enough yard space for the garden Patty kept mentioning. It needed work, new roof and outdated kitchen, but it had good bones and character. The price was within reach if I managed the inheritance carefully. I drove by the house several times over the next week, each visit making it feel more real as a possibility. The current owners had already moved out, leaving it vacant and slightly forlorn. I imagined the studio filled with my design equipment, the yard transformed with raised beds and flowering plants, the interior walls painted in colors I chose without having to consult anyone else's preferences. The fantasy was interrupted by another call from Denise. "We have a court date," she announced. 3 months from now. Judge Patricia Morrison presiding. She's fair but no nonsense. She won't tolerate theatrics from either side. 3 months felt simultaneously too soon and impossibly far away. What happens between now and then? Discovery continues. Both sides will exchange evidence and witness lists. We'll prepare our case, they'll prepare theirs. And Claire, she paused significantly, you need to be prepared for them to dig into everything. They'll interview your neighbors, your clients, anyone who might have information about your life and character. The thought of Lawrence Chen's investigators talking to people in Bellhaven made me feel violated. This was my sanctuary, the place I'd come to escape exactly this kind of scrutiny. Now I was bringing the chaos directly to my doorstep. I need to tell people, I realized. My neighbors, my friends here. They deserve to know what's coming rather than being ambushed by investigators asking intrusive questions. That's wise, Denise agreed. Frame it on your terms. Explain the situation honestly and ask for their support. Most people are more sympathetic than you'd expect, especially when they can see someone's being bullied. I started with Patty and Thomas, walking over that evening after I'd rehearsed what I wanted to say. They listened without interruption as I explained the full situation, including the likelihood that investigators would soon be asking questions about me. Let them come, Thomas said firmly when I finished. They'll hear that you're a good neighbor, a hard worker, and someone who minds her own business. Nothing scandalous about any of that. Patty was more thoughtful. You should talk to folks at the community center too. Rachel, the yoga instructor, people from your library volunteering. Give them a heads up so they're not caught off guard. Over the next week, I had a series of awkward conversations, explaining my situation to people I deliberately kept at arm's length. Each conversation felt like removing a layer of protective armor, exposing myself to potential judgment or rejection. To my surprise, the response was overwhelmingly supportive. Rachel was particularly fierce in her support. Anyone comes asking me about you, I'm telling them you're one of the most genuine people I've met in this town. Which is true, by the way. You might be a bit closed off sometimes, but you're honest and kind. That counts for a lot. Even my yoga instructor, a serene woman named Beth who rarely spoke about anything beyond breathing techniques and proper alignment, offered unexpected support. I've watched you grow in your practice over the past 2 years. Someone who shows up consistently, works through discomfort, and respects the process isn't someone who manipulates or schemes. I'll be happy to say so if anyone asks. Their faith in me, based on limited interactions and surface-level knowledge, felt simultaneously humbling and empowering. I'd been so focused on keeping people at a distance that I hadn't recognized the community I'd accidentally built. These people saw me more clearly than I'd realized, and what they saw was apparently worth defending. The community center became an unexpected source of strength. I'd attended workshops there occasionally, always sitting in the back and leaving quickly rather than joining the social gatherings afterward. Now I forced myself to stay, to engage in conversations, to let people know me beyond the polite stranger role I'd maintained. At a digital marketing workshop for local businesses, I met Gregory Sullivan, who owned a small bookshop in town. We started talking about design principles for promotional materials, and he mentioned he'd been thinking about rebranding but couldn't afford Portland design firms. I could help with that, I offered, surprising myself. I do graphic design consulting. I could give you a local discount. The project that emerged was exactly what I needed. Working with Gregory on his bookshop rebrand reminded me why I'd loved design in the first place. Not the corporate work I'd done in Portland, creating sterile materials for companies I didn't care about, but creative problem solving for a real person with a genuine passion for their business. Gregory wanted to attract more tourists while maintaining his appeal to local readers. We spent hours discussing the bookshop's identity, its role in the community, the experience he wanted customers to have. I sketched logo concepts and color palettes, pulling inspiration from Bellhaven's coastal landscape and literary heritage. The work energized me in ways my usual corporate consulting never had. I found myself staying up late refining concepts, not because of deadlines but because I was genuinely excited about the project. When I presented the final designs to Gregory, his face lit up with the kind of authentic joy that made every hour of work worthwhile. "This is exactly what I imagined but couldn't articulate," he said, studying the new logo with obvious delight. "You captured something essential about what I'm trying to build here." Word of the bookshop project spread through Bellhaven's small business community. Within weeks, I had inquiries from the Driftwood Cafe owner about menu redesign, from a local gallery about promotional materials, from a real estate agent about new business cards. Each project connected me more deeply to the town, transforming me from a resident to a participant. The work also provided concrete evidence for my legal case. Denise was pleased when I sent her the contracts and invoices, noting that they demonstrated my professional competence and my integration into the Bellhaven community. "You're building a paper trail that contradicts everything Vanessa's team is alleging. Keep it up." But the investigation Denise had warned about arrived sooner than expected. I was at the Driftwood Cafe working on the menu redesign when a man in an expensive suit approached my table. "Claire Dawson. I'm here representing the Hartley estate. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your relationship with David Hartley." Every head in the cafe turned toward us. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, embarrassment warring with anger at the public ambush. "I'm not answering questions without my attorney present." The investigator smiled, not pleasantly. "That's your right, of course. But I should mention that I'll be speaking with everyone in this establishment, as well as your neighbors, clients, and associates. It would be simpler if you just cooperated now." The threat was clear: cooperate or watch me make your life difficult by questioning everyone you know. I stood up, gathering my laptop and papers with deliberate calm. "You can contact my attorney, Denise Cho, to schedule any interviews. I'm not discussing my private life in a public cafe." I walked out with my head high, but my hands were shaking. Behind me, I could hear the investigator approaching other tables, beginning his campaign of intrusive questioning. By the time I got home, my phone was already ringing with calls from concerned neighbors and friends who'd been contacted. Patty called first, her voice tight with fury. Even David's mother had agreed to testify, though Denise warned me her testimony might be double-edged. "Diane Hartley is going to tell the truth as she sees it," Denise explained. "That means she'll confirm you and David had a real marriage that ended amicably. But she'll also probably say she doesn't understand why he kept you as beneficiary and that it hurt Vanessa. We need to be prepared for that complexity." Vanessa's witness list was predictably hostile. David's brother Preston would testify about how devoted David had been to Vanessa, implying that keeping me as beneficiary must have been an oversight. Several of Vanessa's friends would speak to her devastation at discovering the beneficiary designation. A forensic accountant had been hired to analyze my finances, looking for any unexplained deposits or expenditures that might suggest David had been supporting me secretly. The accusation was so absurd it would have been laughable if it wasn't so insulting. Every dollar I'd earned in the past 7 years had come from my own work, documented and taxed appropriately. But I understood the strategy. Throw enough mud and hope some of it sticks, create enough doubt that the judge might split the difference rather than awarding me everything. 2 weeks before trial, Denise requested a meeting to go over my testimony. We met at her office, and she put me through another grueling practice session, this time focusing on the specific questions likely to come up in court. "Why do you think David kept you as beneficiary?" she asked, playing the role of opposing counsel. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "We never discussed it. I wasn't aware of the designation until after his death." "But you must have some theory. Did he still have feelings for you?" "I have no evidence of that. Our communication after the divorce was minimal and strictly practical." Denise nodded approvingly. "Good. Stay humble, stay factual. Don't speculate about David's motives because you genuinely don't know them. The mystery of why he did this actually works in our favor. It prevents them from pinning any manipulative intent on you." We practiced for hours, until my answers felt automatic and my composure unshakable. By the end, I felt as prepared as I could be for what promised to be the most challenging experience of my life. The depositions had been difficult, but those had occurred in private offices with limited audiences. This would be an open court, with spectators and possibly media attention given the size of the estate involved. The night before trial, I couldn't sleep. I walked down to the beach despite the late hour, letting the sound of waves and the bite of salt air clear my racing mind. Tomorrow would determine so much about my future, not just financially but in terms of how I saw myself and how others saw me. I thought about the woman I'd been 7 years ago, sitting in a cheap Italian pension after being abandoned by her husband. That woman had been terrified and lost, unsure how she'd survive the next day, much less build a new life. The woman I'd become was stronger, more capable, more certain of her own worth. Whatever happened in court tomorrow couldn't take that away from me. Patty found me on the beach, wrapped in a blanket against the chill. "Figured I'd find you here," she said, settling onto the sand beside me. "Tomorrow's the day." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "You know what I think?" Patty said after a long silence. "I think you've already won the important battle. You took a terrible thing and turned it into an opportunity to rebuild yourself. The money, the house, the court case, that's all just details. The real victory is who you've become." Her words brought tears to my eyes, releasing some of the tension I'd been holding. "Thank you," I managed. "For everything. For believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." "That's what community does," she said simply. "We hold each other up when we can't stand alone. Now come on, you need sleep. You've got a trial to win tomorrow." The courthouse loomed before me, all concrete and glass reflecting the gray Portland sky. I'd dressed carefully that morning in a navy suit Patty had insisted I buy for the occasion, professional but not ostentatious. My hands trembled slightly as I gathered my bag from the car, and I took several deep breaths before walking toward the entrance. Denise met me in the lobby, her expression calm and focused. She walked me through what to expect one final time, the order of proceedings, who would testify when, the importance of maintaining composure regardless of what was said. Her steady confidence helped anchor my nerves as we rode the elevator to the courtroom on the 5th floor. The courtroom was already filling with people when we entered. I spotted Vanessa immediately, seated at the plaintiff's table with Lawrence Chen and another attorney I didn't recognize. She wore elegant black, her blonde hair styled perfectly, and when our eyes met across the room, her expression was pure venom. Behind her sat Preston and several other people I assumed were David's extended family or Vanessa's supporters. On our side of the room, I was touched to see a small group from Bellhaven had made the drive. Patty and Thomas sat in the front row of the gallery, with Rachel beside them. Even Gregory from the bookshop had come, along with Beth from the yoga studio. Their presence bolstered my courage more than they probably realized. The bailiff called for everyone to rise as Judge Patricia Morrison entered. She was a black woman in her late 50s, with intelligent eyes and an air of complete authority. She surveyed the courtroom with an expression that suggested she'd seen every trick in the book and wasn't impressed by any of them. The proceedings began with opening statements. Lawrence Chen rose first, his voice smooth and persuasive as he painted a picture of devoted spouses torn apart by tragedy, only to discover that the deceased husband had inexplicably maintained his ex-wife as beneficiary on substantial assets. He spoke of Vanessa's devastation, her confusion, her justified anger at what could only be explained as either severe negligence or undue influence. My client, Mrs. Vanessa Hartley, married David Hartley in good faith, believing she was entering a partnership that would include shared financial security. Instead, she discovered that her husband had maintained his former wife as beneficiary on policies worth over $1 million combined. The only reasonable explanation is that Ms. Dawson maintained some form of influence or contact with the deceased that prevented him from making the natural and appropriate changes one would expect upon remarriage. When Denise stood to give our opening statement, her tone was equally confident but more grounded in facts. The evidence will show that Claire Dawson and David Hartley had virtually no contact after their divorce 7 years ago. Ms. Dawson built an entirely independent life in a different city, pursuing her career and personal growth without any involvement from or with her ex-husband. Mr. Hartley's decision to maintain her as beneficiary was his choice, made repeatedly and recently, with full capacity and clear intent. While we may never know his exact reasoning, the law is clear that a person has the right to designate whomever they choose as beneficiary, regardless of whether others approve of that choice. The first witness called was Vanessa herself. She took the stand with visible emotion, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue as Lawrence led her through questions about her marriage to David. She described a loving partnership, plans for their future, her shock at discovering the beneficiary designations after his sudden death. "I had no idea," she said, her voice breaking. "We talked about everything, our finances, our goals, our dreams. He never mentioned keeping Claire as beneficiary. The only explanation is that he forgot to change it, or that she somehow convinced him not to." Denise's cross-examination was surgical and precise. "Mrs. Hartley, did your husband handle the family finances primarily himself?" "Yes," Vanessa admitted. "He was better with those details than I was." "So you wouldn't necessarily know about all his financial accounts and policies?" "I knew about most of them," Vanessa insisted, "but clearly not all." Denise produced documents showing that David had updated the beneficiary designations just 8 months before his death. "Did your husband seem mentally compromised 8 months ago? Suffering from any cognitive decline or mental illness?" "No," Vanessa said reluctantly. "He was perfectly healthy until the heart attack." "So he was capable of making his own financial decisions?" "Yes. And yet he chose to maintain Ms. Dawson as beneficiary." "That was his choice, wasn't it?" Vanessa's composure cracked. "He wouldn't have done that if she hadn't manipulated him somehow. They must have been in contact. She must have convinced him to keep her on the policies." "Do you have any evidence of this contact?" Denise pressed. "Any phone records, emails, text messages, witnesses who saw them together?" "No, but any evidence at all that they communicated after the divorce beyond the minimal documented contacts regarding tax documents?" Vanessa's attorney objected, and Judge Morrison sustained it, but the point had been made. Vanessa's certainty was based on emotion and assumption, not evidence. The next witness was Preston, David's brother, who testified about his siblings' devotion to Vanessa and his confusion about the beneficiary situation. But under cross-examination, he admitted he'd only seen David and Vanessa together a handful of times per year and couldn't speak to the intimate details of their marriage or David's financial decision-making process. Then came the forensic accountant Vanessa had hired, a dry man who presented an analysis of my financial records looking for evidence of payments from David. His testimony backfired spectacularly when Denise got him to admit under questioning that my income and expenses were completely consistent with someone living modestly on freelance consulting income, with no unexplained deposits or lifestyle inflation that would suggest hidden support. In fact, Denise pressed, "Ms. Dawson's financial records show someone living well below her means, correct? Someone who could afford more expensive housing and lifestyle choices but chooses not to." "That's accurate," the accountant admitted. "Does that sound like someone expecting a large inheritance? Or someone who's built a sustainable, independent life?" Lawrence objected, but the damage to his narrative was done. The afternoon session began with witnesses supporting my character. Marcus took the stand and calmly explained our relationship and its end, making clear it had nothing to do with lingering feelings for David and everything to do with different life goals. He spoke well of me, describing me as honest and thoughtful, someone who'd been clear about her emotional boundaries rather than leading him on. Several of my former colleagues from Portland testified about my professional competence and the clear separation I'd maintained from David after our divorce. One woman recalled me specifically declining to attend an industry event because I knew David would be there, saying I wanted to avoid any awkwardness. It wasn't the behavior of someone secretly maintaining a relationship. Then Patty took the stand, and I felt tears threaten as she described finding me collapsed in her olive grove 3 years ago. She wasn't seeking David Hartley or anyone else, Patty said firmly. She was a woman starting over, learning new skills, building a new life from nothing. I've watched her transform from someone running away from pain to someone running toward purpose. That's not manipulation, that's resilience. Lawrence's cross-examination tried to suggest I'd targeted Bellhaven specifically because it was near where David sometimes vacationed, but Patty shut that down immediately. David Hartley never set foot in Bellhaven as far as I know. This is a small town. We'd remember someone like that visiting. Claire chose our town because it's quiet and healing, not because of any connection to her ex-husband. The most anticipated testimony came from Diane, David's mother. She walked to the stand with visible reluctance, her eyes finding mine briefly with an expression I couldn't read. Lawrence questioned her first, clearly hoping she'd support Vanessa's position as family. "Mrs. Hartley, did your son love his wife Vanessa?" "Very much," Diane said. "They seemed happy together." "Were you surprised to learn he'd kept his ex-wife as beneficiary?" "Deeply surprised," she admitted. "It didn't make sense to me." Lawrence smiled, sensing victory. "Do you believe your son would have wanted his estate to go to his ex-wife rather than his current spouse?" Diane was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know what David wanted. He didn't discuss it with me." "But surely, I know what I wanted," Diane interrupted. "I wanted him to live. I wanted to watch him grow old with whoever made him happy. But he's gone, and I can't speak for his intentions because he never told me about this decision." When Denise cross-examined, Diane's testimony took a different turn. "You knew Claire when she was married to your son?" "Yes. She was a good daughter-in-law. Kind, thoughtful, tried hard to make David happy." "Did their divorce seem acrimonious to you?" "No," Diane said. "Sad, but not angry. They both seemed to recognize they'd grown apart and were mature about ending things." "Have you seen any evidence that Claire tried to maintain inappropriate contact with David after the divorce?" "None whatsoever." "Do you believe she's capable of the manipulation being alleged?" Diane looked directly at me, then at Vanessa, then back to Denise. "No. Claire isn't manipulative. She's conflict-averse if anything, more likely to walk away than fight for something. Whatever David's reasons for keeping her as beneficiary, I don't believe she had anything to do with it." The testimony that followed felt almost anticlimactic after Diane's measured but supportive words. Rachel spoke about my integration into the Bellhaven community. Gregory discussed the professional design work I'd done for his bookshop. Beth described my consistent attendance at yoga classes and my willingness to co-facilitate a support group for others going through difficult transitions. Each witness painted the same picture of someone who'd moved on completely from her former marriage and built an independent, meaningful life. The accumulation of testimony created a narrative that directly contradicted everything Vanessa's team had alleged. Finally, it was my turn to testify. I walked to the stand with my heart hammering, acutely aware of every eye in the courtroom following me. After being sworn in, I sat down and tried to project the calm confidence Denise had coached me toward, even though my insides were churning. Denise led me through my story chronologically. Our marriage, its gradual deterioration, the amicable divorce, my post-divorce life in Portland and then Bellhaven. I spoke about my work, my relationships, my decision to leave the city for something simpler and more peaceful. When she asked about my contact with David after the divorce, I was precise and factual. We exchanged perhaps a dozen emails over 7 years, mostly about tax documents or forwarding mail. We spoke on the phone 3 times that I can recall, all brief conversations about administrative matters. I saw him in person once, at our final divorce hearing. That was the extent of our contact. "Did you ever ask him to maintain you as beneficiary on his life insurance or other accounts?" "Absolutely not. I didn't know I was listed as beneficiary until after his death." "How did you feel when you learned of the designation?" "Shocked," I said honestly. "Confused. It didn't make sense to me. We divided everything cleanly in the divorce. I never expected or wanted anything more from him." "Do you believe you deserve this inheritance?" The question caught me off guard, and I paused to consider it carefully. I believe David had the right to designate whomever he chose as beneficiary. Whether I deserve it isn't really the question. The question is whether his clearly stated wishes should be honored. Lawrence's cross-examination was as aggressive as I'd anticipated. He tried to trap me in contradictions about the timeline of events, suggested I was lying about the extent of my contact with David, insinuated that I must have known about the beneficiary designation and deliberately kept quiet about it. I maintained my composure, answering each question as truthfully and simply as possible. When he tried to make my move to Bellhaven sound suspicious, I explained it plainly. I needed space from my past and memories of my marriage. Bellhaven offered that. There was no conspiracy, just a desire for a fresh start. He pressed me about my financial situation, suggesting I'd been struggling and therefore had motive to manipulate David. I calmly walked him through my income and expenses, demonstrating that while I lived modestly, I was financially stable through my own work. "You're asking this court to believe," Lawrence said with barely concealed contempt, "that you had absolutely nothing to do with David Hartley maintaining you as beneficiary on over $1 million in assets? I'm asking the court to recognize that David Hartley was a competent adult who made his own financial decisions," I replied steadily. "Whatever his reasons, they were his own. I had no knowledge of and no influence over those decisions." When I finally stepped down from the stand, I felt wrung out but relieved. I'd said what needed to be said without falling apart or losing my temper. Whether it was enough remained to be seen. The closing arguments painted starkly different pictures. Lawrence portrayed me as a calculating opportunist who'd somehow maintained a hold over David despite 7 years of supposed separation. Denise countered with the weight of evidence showing a complete lack of contact or influence, emphasizing David's mental competence and his repeated, deliberate choice to maintain the beneficiary designations. "This isn't about what Mrs. Vanessa Hartley wishes had happened," Denise concluded. "It's about what David Hartley actually chose to do with his own assets. The law protects the right of individuals to make their own decisions about beneficiary designations, even when those decisions confuse or hurt others. The evidence overwhelmingly shows that Mr. Hartley made this choice freely and repeatedly. His wishes should be honored." Judge Morrison announced she would take the matter under advisement and issue a written ruling within 2 weeks. The wait would be agonizing, but there was nothing to do except trust that the evidence would speak for itself. As we filed out of the courtroom, Vanessa's group on one side and mine on the other, she caught my arm in the hallway. "This isn't over," she hissed. "Even if you win, everyone will know what you are. A vulture who profited from my husband's death." I pulled my arm free gently. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said, meaning it despite everything. "I genuinely am. But I won't apologize for being the person David chose to leave his assets to. That was his decision, not mine." Her face contorted with rage, but Preston pulled her away before she could respond. I watched them disappear down the hallway, feeling an unexpected sense of pity. Vanessa's anger was eating her alive, poisoning whatever grief she might be processing over David's death. Even if she won the legal battle, she'd lose something important in the process. Patty hugged me tightly in the courthouse lobby. "You did beautifully up there. Honest and strong. We're all proud of you." The drive back to Bellhaven felt different than the drive to Portland had. Win or lose, I'd stood up for myself in a way I never could have done 7 years ago. I'd defended my character and my choices in front of a judge and a courtroom full of people. The terrified woman who'd been abandoned in Italy had transformed into someone who could face down hostile attorneys and public judgment without crumbling. Rachel insisted on buying dinner at the Driftwood Cafe, gathering our small group to decompress from the day. The cafe owner, who'd testified briefly about my regular patronage and normal behavior, gave us a corner table and brought over wine without being asked. To Claire, Rachel raised her glass. "For having the courage to fight for what's right." We clinked glasses, and I felt the warmth of community settling around me like a protective cloak. Whatever Judge Morrison decided, I wasn't alone in this. I had people who believed in me, who saw my worth, who would stand beside me regardless of the outcome. The 2 weeks of waiting were some of the longest of my life. I threw myself into work, completing design projects for local businesses and beginning preliminary sketches for the house renovations I hoped I'd be able to afford. The uncertainty was maddening, but I refused to put my life completely on hold while awaiting the ruling. Denise called regularly with updates that weren't really updates, just reassurances that the wait was normal and that she felt good about our case. I tried to take comfort in her confidence, but anxiety gnawed at me constantly. Late at night, I'd walk the beach and imagine both scenarios, what I'd do if I won and what I'd do if I lost. Losing meant more than just the money, though that would hurt. It meant watching David's wishes be overturned, having my character publicly impugned, possibly being driven out of Bellhaven by the scandal and gossip. Winning meant resources and opportunities, but also the burden of carrying David's final gift and whatever complex motivations had driven him to give it. On day 13 of waiting, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read simply, "From David." My hands shook as I opened it, wondering if this was some cruel trick from Vanessa's legal team. The message was brief, apparently sent through a delayed email service David had set up before his death. "Claire," it began. "If you're reading this, I'm gone and you've learned about the beneficiary designations. I imagine you're confused and possibly angry, so I want to explain. I kept you as beneficiary for 2 reasons. First, because you deserved better than what our marriage gave you. You made yourself smaller to accommodate my ambitions, and I didn't appreciate that sacrifice until after you were gone. This money can't make up for those lost years, but it can give you opportunities to pursue the dreams you set aside. Second, and I'm not proud of this, Vanessa married me for security and status. I knew it when I proposed, and I accepted it because I was lonely and wanted companionship without deep emotional investment. Our marriage was comfortable but not profound. Leaving her the house and my retirement accounts provides for her more than adequately. The life insurance and investment accounts I kept designated to you because you'll use them for something meaningful rather than just maintaining a lifestyle. I'm sorry I never had the courage to tell you this while I was alive. I'm sorry for many things about how our marriage ended and how I let you shoulder blame that should have been shared. You were always stronger than you realized, Claire. I hope this inheritance helps you see that. Take care of yourself. You deserved better than me, and I hope you find it. David." I read the email 3 times, tears streaming down my face. All this time, I'd wondered why, searching for explanations that made sense of David's choice. Now I had my answer, and it was both simpler and more complex than anything I'd imagined. He'd been trying to make amends, to give me something he felt I'd been denied during our marriage. The revelation changed something in how I thought about the inheritance. It wasn't random chance or administrative oversight. It was a gift from someone who'd recognized, too late, that I'd given up pieces of myself to support his journey. Whether I agreed with his assessment didn't change the fact that this had been his intention. I forwarded the email to Denise immediately, knowing it could be crucial to our case even though the trial had concluded. She called within minutes, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "This is exactly what we needed. It establishes clear intent and explains the reasoning. I'm submitting it to the judge immediately as supplemental evidence." 2 days later, the ruling arrived. Judge Morrison's written decision was thorough and decisive. She'd reviewed all the evidence, considered both parties' arguments, and concluded that David Hartley had acted with full mental capacity and clear intent when maintaining Claire Dawson as his beneficiary. The designations would stand as written, with the full inheritance awarded to me. In her ruling, she noted that while Vanessa's disappointment was understandable, the law protected an individual's right to designate beneficiaries without requiring those choices to conform to others' expectations. David's email, submitted as supplemental evidence, further demonstrated that his decision had been thoughtful and deliberate rather than accidental or coerced. The court finds no evidence of undue influence, fraud, or any other grounds that would justify overturning the deceased's clearly stated wishes. Mrs. Vanessa Hartley is adequately provided for through other assets in the estate. The beneficiary designations to Ms. Claire Dawson shall be honored as written. I sat in stunned silence after reading the ruling, the words blurring on the page as tears obscured my vision. I'd won. Not through manipulation or tricks, but because the truth had been sufficient. David's wishes would be honored, and I would receive the inheritance he'd intended for me. Denise was jubilant when I called her. "This is a complete victory, Claire. Vanessa can appeal, but frankly, Judge Morrison's ruling is so thoroughly reasoned that I doubt any appellate court would overturn it. You should start making plans for how you want to use this money." Plans. The word felt almost foreign after months of simply surviving the legal battle day by day. Now I needed to think about the future, about what I wanted to build with the resources David had left me. The house was the obvious first step, transforming the contingent offer into an actual purchase. But beyond that, the possibilities felt overwhelming and exhilarating in equal measure. I walked down to the beach to process the news, needing the familiar rhythm of waves and salt air to ground me in reality. Patty found me there, as she so often did, and I told her about the ruling and David's email. So now you know why, she said softly. Does it help? I thought about the question carefully. It helps to know it wasn't random or forgotten. It helps to understand that David was trying to give me something he felt I'd lost. Whether that makes me more deserving is still something I'm working through. You're deserving because you're a human being who survived hard things and built a good life, Patty said firmly. The money is just a tool. What matters is what you do with it. Her words crystallized something I'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. The inheritance wasn't about deserving or not deserving. It was about opportunity, about having resources to pursue the dreams and goals I'd set aside or never dared to imagine. What I did with that opportunity would determine whether David's gift had real meaning. The inheritance cleared within a month, and suddenly I held resources I'd never imagined possessing. The first call I made was to Sandra Liu, confirming I wanted to proceed with purchasing the Craftsman house. The second was to the contractor I'd been consulting with, authorizing the roof repair and kitchen renovation to begin immediately. Walking through my soon-to-be home with the contractor felt surreal. This space belonged to me, purchased with money David had intended specifically for my dreams and opportunities. The studio building in back would become my design office, properly equipped with the tools and technology I'd been making do without. The garden space where Patty promised to help me plant vegetables represented putting down roots I'd been too afraid to commit to before. The community center support group became another focus. Beth and I held our first meeting with 12 attendees, people navigating divorces, job losses, health crises, and various other life upheavals. Sharing my story, the abandonment in Italy and the unexpected inheritance, the legal battle and ultimate victory, felt vulnerable but important. Several participants told me afterward that knowing someone else had survived such dramatic changes gave them hope for their own situations. Gregory's bookshop rebrand led to more commercial design work than I could handle alone. I hired 2 recent design school graduates as contractors, mentoring them while building a small creative studio that served Bellhaven's growing small business community. The work energized me in ways corporate consulting never had, connecting my skills directly to people and projects I cared about. Vanessa did appeal the ruling, as Denise had predicted she might. But the appellate court affirmed Judge Morrison's decision within 3 months, ending the legal battle definitively. I felt relief more than triumph when Denise called with the news. It was finally, completely over. David's wishes would stand, and I could move forward without the constant anxiety of litigation hanging over everything. The house renovations took 4 months, transforming the tired craftsman into something both beautiful and functional. I chose colors and finishes that reflected my aesthetic rather than anyone else's preferences, creating spaces that felt authentically mine. Moving in felt like claiming not just a physical home but a version of myself I'd been building towards since that desperate night in the Italian pension. Patty and Thomas helped me plant the garden that first spring, teaching me about soil preparation and companion planting. Working the earth alongside them, I understood what Patty had meant about nurturing things from seed to harvest. The physical labor connected me to the land and the community in ways that observing from a distance never could. One afternoon while I was painting the studio, Rachel stopped by with coffee and news. "I've been thinking about your story," she said. "About second chances and rebuilding. I think you should write it down, maybe as a memoir or essay collection. Other people going through similar things need to know they can survive and even thrive afterward." The suggestion planted itself in my mind, taking root gradually. I started writing in the evenings, not with any specific publication goal but as a way of processing everything that had happened. The words flowed surprisingly easily, chronicling the journey from abandoned wife to independent woman with her own home and business and community. David's mother reached out 6 months after the final ruling, asking if we could meet for coffee. I drove to Portland nervously, unsure what to expect. Diane looked older than I remembered, grief having carved deeper lines around her eyes and mouth. "I wanted to tell you that I'm glad you won," she said after we'd ordered. "Not because I think Vanessa was wrong to feel hurt, but because David clearly wanted this for you. I've been going through his things, and I found journals where he wrote about regret over how your marriage ended. About feeling like he'd taken more than he gave. The inheritance was his way of trying to balance those scales." We talked for over an hour, sharing memories of David and acknowledging the complicated truth that people can be deeply flawed and still capable of meaningful gestures. When we parted, Diane hugged me tightly. "Thank you for honoring his memory by using this gift well. That's all any parent can hope for their child's legacy." A year after the ruling, I organized a gathering at my home for everyone who'd supported me through the legal battle. Patty and Thomas, Rachel and Beth, Gregory and other Bellhaven friends, even Marcus drove down from Seattle. We filled the renovated house with laughter and food, celebrating not just my victory but the community that had made it possible. Standing in my kitchen, watching people I cared about enjoying the space I'd created, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete peace with my choices and my life. David's inheritance had given me financial security and opportunities, but the real gift had been the catalyst it provided for me to finally stop hiding and start building. The woman who'd been abandoned in Italy would barely recognize the person I'd become. Stronger, more confident, deeply rooted in community and purpose. Sometimes I still thought about that terrified night in the pension, wondering what that version of me would think of where I'd ended up. I hoped she'd be proud of the journey, even though none of it had gone according to any plan. Vanessa sent a brief email on the 2-year anniversary of David's death. It wasn't an apology exactly, more an acknowledgement that her anger had been misdirected. She'd remarried, she wrote, to someone who made her feel valued in ways David never had. She hoped I was doing well with the inheritance. I wrote back with equal brevity, wishing her happiness and meaning it genuinely. We'd both been casualties of David's complicated emotional landscape in different ways. Her moving forward felt like the final chapter closing on that whole painful saga. My design studio thrived, my garden produced more vegetables than I could eat, my friendships deepened into genuine chosen family. The inheritance sat mostly invested, providing security and occasional funding for projects that mattered. I donated to the community center, established a scholarship for design students, helped fund the bookshop's expansion. David had wanted to give me opportunities, and I'd honored that gift by using it to build something meaningful. Not just for myself, but for the community that had welcomed and supported me when I needed it most. The abandoned wife had become a woman who belonged somewhere, who contributed something, who transformed loss into purpose. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.